When I felt the soft graze of the measuring tape around my waist, I froze, not because I was surprised, but because it had been so long since anyone touched me with such intention. He didn't say a word. He just kept pulling the tape snug, his fingers grazing the curve of my hip with clinical precision. Or maybe I only wanted to believe it was clinical. My breath hitched when he looked up at me, eyes steady, as if he was trying to remember something about me he'd long forgotten. Maybe the shape of my body. Maybe the way I used to laugh when I was 25. My pulse echoed in my ears, not from attraction, I told myself, but from guilt. It was just fabric. Just a fitting. Just helping a family member, after all these years. And yet when I stepped away and saw my reflection, the way I stood taller, straighter, with a blush that didn't belong on a woman my age, I knew I had crossed a line. Not with him. Not with my husband. But with myself. That was 3 months ago. And everything that happened after began with that single moment of touch. That single breath. That single thought I never should have let live. Let me take you back, before I tell you the one thing I've never told anyone, and before I ask you something in return. Tell me in the comments below where you're watching this from, and tell me, has a single, innocent moment ever changed the course of your entire life? It started with a suggestion I never expected, and maybe that's why I said yes. My husband had left again for one of his week-long business trips, his bags already in the car before I came downstairs. He kissed me lightly on the cheek, told me not to wait up for his calls, and vanished like he always did. I stood there for a while in the quiet kitchen, hands wrapped around a coffee cup I didn't want, thinking about how easy it had become to live beside each other without actually touching. Later that morning, I ran into his father outside. We rarely spoke more than polite greetings. But that day he smiled and asked if I had ever thought about updating my wardrobe. He said it casually, like a joke, but there was something about the way he said it. Not mocking. Not suggestive. Just observant. He'd always been quiet, restrained, with a kind of invisible authority I once found intimidating. He told me he still had his old measuring tools from when he did tailoring work, and that it might be fun to make me something new. A woman deserves to feel like herself again, he added. I don't know why that line hit me so hard. I agreed. I told myself it would be quick. Innocent. Just a bit of cloth and chalk. When I arrived at his place that afternoon, I was suddenly aware of every inch of my body. Not because of him, not yet. But because of how unfamiliar it felt to be looked at in detail. I stood in the center of his study while he worked with calm, efficient gestures. The measuring tape circled my chest, then my waist, then my hips. He asked for no movement, no comments. Just stillness. But his hands, they weren't inappropriate, they weren't even close. And yet the way they brushed against my side made something long dormant inside me ache. Not sexually. Not yet. It was deeper than that. It was the ache of being noticed. Of being handled with care. Of being something more than a fixture in a house that ran on routine and low-volume TV. Afterward, he offered me tea. I declined. My heart was pounding. He didn't press. He simply said the patterns would be ready next week, and walked me to the door like a gentleman. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and looked at myself differently. I wasn't young. I wasn't glamorous. But I was still a woman. My neckline, my collarbones, my waist, none of it had disappeared. I just hadn't paid attention in years. My phone buzzed. A message from my husband, landed safely. Busy already. No kiss emoji. No, I miss you. Just logistics. I didn't reply. The next morning, I woke early and went for a walk. I passed by a bridal shop and stopped in front of the display window. A mannequin in a sleek, tailored gown stood tall and confident. Not lacy. Not romantic. Just strong. I thought of how different I felt when that tape circled my ribs. Like a body that could be defined again. In the evening, the phone rang. I thought it would be my husband, but it was his father. He asked if I could come by again. He'd found a better fabric, something more honest to your shape, he said. I hesitated. Then I said yes. When I arrived, the lights were dimmer this time. Not romantically so, just softer. Less clinical. He held up a bolt of gray-blue fabric and draped it over my shoulder. You always suited calm colors, he said. I tried to laugh it off, but his fingers lingered longer this time. Not inappropriate. Just warm. Just human. He never looked me in the eyes after that. But he didn't move away either. I left quickly, cheeks flushed, not because of guilt, not yet, but because something in me had been moved, and I didn't know how to put it back. The next few days passed in slow tension. Every time my phone lit up, I hoped it was him. Every time it wasn't, I felt ridiculous. I started choosing my clothes more deliberately. Not to impress. Just to remind myself I could still feel something when I wore them. I told myself nothing had happened. I told myself I was loyal. But even as I repeated it, my hands were already smoothing my skirts more often. Fixing my lipstick. Touching my neck in the mirror before leaving the house. My husband called midweek. I didn't answer. Not to punish him. Just because I didn't want to pretend to be the version of me he expected. Not today. That night, I couldn't sleep. My body hummed. Not with lust. With a kind of low-frequency awareness that I hadn't felt in years. A readiness I hadn't invited. I told myself I would cancel the next appointment. That I didn't need the dress. But I already knew I would go. I already knew that something had begun. And I knew, even if I didn't say it out loud, that I didn't want to stop it. The day of the second fitting arrived with a sense of heaviness I couldn't shake. I woke up earlier than usual, unable to rest, pacing in the kitchen with a cup of tea I didn't drink. My reflection in the microwave's glass door caught my eye, and my mouth was set in a line I didn't recognize. Not anxiety, not guilt exactly. It was anticipation, and that frightened me more than anything. I had convinced myself the first visit was innocent. But this time, I couldn't lie to myself so easily. I changed clothes 3 times before settling on something plain, a navy blouse, dark jeans, hair in a low bun. I didn't want to look like I was dressing up. But I couldn't show up looking careless either. The balance was delicate, and I hated that I cared this much. He was just my husband's father. This was just another fitting. But my pulse told a different story. When I arrived, the door was already open, as if he had been expecting me. He didn't greet me with words, just a small nod and a gesture toward the workroom. Everything was already laid out, fabric, chalk, pins, measuring tape. The same neutral lighting, the same quiet music from the radio in the background. But the air felt different. Denser. He asked me to step onto the platform again, the one slightly raised by a few inches. I obeyed without comment. There was something almost ritualistic in the way I stood there, arms out, waiting. He moved with his usual calm precision, measuring tape around my shoulder, down my side, around my waist again. But this time, I felt every centimeter of contact. My skin tingled under my clothes, not from pleasure, but from awareness. I wasn't imagining it. There was hesitation in his movements now. A longer pause between measurements. A deeper breath before adjusting the fabric at my hips. Then it happened. A shift in the air. My hand, resting awkwardly at my side, brushed against his. Neither of us moved. Not right away. And then, we kissed. It was not planned. It was not dramatic. It was a quiet thing, brief, restrained. But it cracked something inside me. He pulled back first. No words passed between us. He simply turned away, placing the tape down on the table with such care it made my heart ache. I stepped off the platform and gathered my bag without looking at him. My mouth was dry. My hands trembled slightly, but I kept my movements calm, deliberate. I thanked him. He nodded. And I left. The sun outside was too bright. The world felt too loud. I walked the long way home, trying to collect myself, replaying the moment again and again, each time trying to make sense of it. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't lustful. It was something else. Something I hadn't named yet. At home, I threw my bag onto the couch and went straight to the bathroom. I washed my face with cold water, avoiding my reflection. My skin was flushed. My pulse still hadn't settled. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and stared at the tiles. White, clean, sterile. I thought of my husband. I thought of how, just last week, he had kissed me goodbye like someone checking a box. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't distant in any intentional way. But he didn't see me anymore. Not really. Not as someone with a body that could still be noticed. The guilt settled in slowly, like fog creeping in under a door. I told myself it meant nothing. It was a moment, an impulse, a slip. But something deeper whispered that it meant everything. That it was the beginning of something I might not be able to stop. My phone buzzed. A message from my husband, long day. Hope yours was easier. I stared at it for a long time before typing a reply. Same here. Just errands and laundry. I pressed send and immediately regretted it. The lie wasn't in the content, it was in the tone. The casual detachment. The small talk of strangers. That night, I made dinner out of habit, not hunger. I chewed each bite without tasting it, staring at the television without seeing. My thoughts returned again and again to that brief moment, the tension in the air before and after, the way he had looked at me, not like a daughter-in-law, but like a woman. And not just any woman. A real one. Flawed, older, but still there. I went to bed early. My body felt heavy, but my mind wouldn't stop moving. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, counting my breaths. I tried to remind myself of who I was. What I had. The home I built. The trust one held. But all of it felt distant, like recalling a dream I wasn't sure had happened. I thought about what would happen if I told someone. A friend. My sister. My therapist, if I still had one. But I already knew the response, cut it off immediately. Don't go back. Tell your husband. Simple solutions for complex impulses. I wasn't ready for any of them. Morning arrived too quickly. I made coffee, opened the curtains, and tried to return to normal. But everything looked different. Every corner of the house felt colder. Every sound sharper. Even the clothes in my closet felt like costumes I no longer fit into. I didn't plan to see him again. I didn't schedule another fitting. I didn't send a message. But I also didn't block his number. Didn't erase the memory. Didn't tell my husband. Because deep down, beneath the guilt and the confusion, I didn't want to forget. I didn't want to pretend it hadn't happened. Not because I wanted more, not yet. But because in that moment, I had felt something I hadn't felt in years. Visible. And once you've felt that, it's hard to go back to being invisible. The days that followed unfolded like a silent standoff between parts of myself I no longer recognized. On the surface, everything was as it had always been. The floors were vacuumed. The fridge was stocked. I answered my husband's occasional texts with polite updates about the weather or dinner plans. I wore the same clothes, used the same shampoo, fed the neighbor's cat when she was away. And yet, underneath all that routine, something had shifted in a way I couldn't undo. I felt like I was walking through my own life with a soundproof barrier around me, seeing it all, participating even, but untouched by any of it. The kiss, if I could even call it that, haunted me in waves. I would think of it and then shove the thought away, only for it to re-emerge hours later in the middle of folding laundry or buttering toast. It wasn't even the kiss itself that consumed me. It was what it meant. Or what it might have meant. I didn't know. That was the problem. There was no roadmap for something like this. No how to for what to do when you realize you've begun crossing lines with someone you shouldn't have even been close enough to. What troubled me more was the absence that followed. He didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't ask me to come in for another fitting. Part of me felt relief, as if some cosmic hand had taken the responsibility away. Another part felt like I'd been dismissed, as if he had decided what that moment meant for both of us and walked away with the final word. I spent more time outdoors than usual, hoping movement might help untangle the knots in my head. I took long walks around the neighborhood, pretending to notice the blooming shrubs or the occasional dog walker, but all I was really doing was trying to quiet the internal noise. I stopped in front of his house once, pretending to fix the laces on my shoe. The lights were off. The car wasn't in the driveway. I stared at the front steps a little too long before forcing myself to move on. By the third day, I realized I was waiting. For what, I wasn't sure. A message. An apology. Another invitation. Anything. The silence itself became a message. One I didn't like. I considered telling my husband something. Not the truth, of course. But some version of it. Maybe a fight that never happened, or a reason to keep some distance from his father. But the idea dissolved the moment I imagined his face. Not angry. Just confused. Hurt, maybe. He would never understand, not because he was incapable, but because I wasn't ready to say the words out loud even to myself. That weekend, I found a note in the mailbox with no envelope. The handwriting was his. Simple and familiar. Patterns are ready. If you'd still like the dress. It wasn't signed. There was no time or day suggested. Just that. A single sentence. My fingers trembled slightly as I read it, though I didn't know why. There was nothing inflammatory about it. Nothing inappropriate. But it was enough to reignite everything I had been trying to smother. I waited 2 days before going. Partly to give myself space, partly to pretend I had the upper hand in whatever this was becoming. On the morning I finally decided to go, I told myself it was just closure. I needed to see him, take the dress, and be done with the whole thing. I rehearsed what I might say. Something polite. Final. Something that made it clear I was still in control of my life. When I arrived, the house looked the same as it always had. Modest, neat, slightly dated. The door was ajar this time, just like before. I stepped inside without knocking, like he somehow expected me. He was in the workroom, already bent over the table, smoothing the fabric out like a priest arranging a cloth before a sermon. He didn't look up at first. I stood in the doorway, waiting. When he did finally meet my eyes, I saw it, the same hesitation I had seen in the mirror that morning. He gestured toward the dress without a word. I approached slowly, brushing my fingers against the fabric. It was beautiful. The kind of simple, elegant design that could make a woman feel seen without needing embellishments. Try it, he said. His voice was quiet, almost distant. I stepped behind the curtain and changed. The fabric fit like memory. It clung in the right places, loosened in the others. I stared at myself in the full-length mirror and saw someone unfamiliar. Someone present. Someone real. When I stepped out, he was no longer looking at me. He was folding another piece of fabric, eyes lowered. I cleared my throat, unsure of what I had come to say. The silence stretched until I couldn't take it anymore. I wasn't expecting the note, I said. He nodded but didn't respond. I waited. Then added, I thought we understood something after the last time. Still nothing. Just the quiet rhythm of his hands folding, arranging, smoothing. And then he said, almost mechanically, you didn't come back. I didn't know how to respond to that. Was that an accusation? A defense? I didn't know if I should, I said. You didn't ask. He finally looked up, and in that moment, I saw how tired he looked. How restrained. How unresolved. We don't need to talk about it, he said. But that wasn't true, and we both knew it. He handed me the dress, neatly folded, wrapped in a plain paper cover. No tag. No price. I took it. Our fingers touched briefly. Then I turned and left. I walked home slowly, the package tucked under my arm like something fragile and illicit. I didn't know what to do with it once I got inside. It felt radioactive. I left it on the kitchen table and went to wash my hands, though there was nothing on them. Later that evening, my husband called. We spoke about logistics again, his flight home, a meeting he had rescheduled, the weather. He asked what I had done that day. I said I'd taken a walk. He said he missed me. I said, me too. And maybe that was true. Maybe what I missed wasn't him specifically, but the version of myself that used to mean something to someone. I hung up and returned to the kitchen. The package was still there. Untouched. Waiting. Like the rest of this strange, unresolved thing that I couldn't name. That I didn't want to name. Not yet. There was a restlessness in me that I couldn't soothe, no matter how much I tried to return to my routines. After taking the dress home, I left it untouched for 3 days, still wrapped in its plain paper like some artifact I wasn't yet ready to examine. Each time I passed it on the table, something tightened in my chest. It was too beautiful to ignore, too intimate to wear without consequence, and too symbolic to simply hang in the closet like any other item of clothing. The weather shifted mid-week, heavy rain clouds gathered, cloaking the days in a kind of gray monotony. I welcomed it. It matched the fog inside my head. I stopped replying to my husband's messages right away. Sometimes I didn't respond at all, and when I did, I kept things brief. He didn't question it. He rarely did. There was an odd freedom in his detachment. It gave me space, but I wasn't sure if I wanted it anymore. On Thursday afternoon, I met with a friend I hadn't seen in months. We sat at a corner table in a quiet cafe, away from the windows, where we wouldn't be interrupted by the occasional passerby. She had always been perceptive, too perceptive, really, and I regretted agreeing to meet her the second I saw her tilt her head slightly when I sat down. You look different, she said. Not bad. Just more alert. I laughed it off, but I knew what she meant. The truth was, I had been paying attention to myself again. The way my clothes sat on my shoulders. The shape of my mouth when I wasn't smiling for someone else's benefit. The weight of my own presence in a room. It was subtle, but it was there. She talked about her work, her divorce, how she'd finally started seeing someone new. I listened, nodded, asked questions, and gave all the right responses. But my mind wasn't fully with her. It drifted back to that room, the silence, the weight of a moment shared and then buried. Toward the end of our coffee, she said something that caught me off guard. I used to think the worst kind of loneliness was being alone. But I've come to believe the real kind is feeling invisible when you're not. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words landed too close to something I had been trying to keep unnamed. When I got home, the house felt unusually still. I moved through the rooms slowly, as if the silence itself was watching me. I ended up in the dining room, standing in front of the package again. I reached out and ran my fingers along the edge of the paper, then unwrapped it carefully, as though afraid of waking something. The dress was even more striking than I remembered. Under different lighting, the color shifted slightly, soft steel blue with undertones that hinted at violet. It was modest but structured, with clean lines that followed the body without clinging too tightly. It was elegant, thoughtful. There was care stitched into every seam. I brought it upstairs and hung it on the closet door. I didn't try it on. Not yet. But just seeing it there, in my space, felt like a decision waiting to be made. That night, I didn't sleep much. My dreams were fragmented, filled with doors that wouldn't close and voices I couldn't understand. I woke before dawn and stood by the window for a long time, watching as the sky shifted from charcoal to ash to soft pale blue. The city was still asleep. I envied it. By mid-morning, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I told myself I needed closure. I told myself I just wanted to return the favor, bring him something in return, a thank you, nothing more. I baked a small batch of lemon shortbread, wrapped them in parchment and string, and walked the 3 blocks to his house before I could talk myself out of it. When I arrived, I hesitated at the door. The air smelled like rain on concrete. Everything was quiet. I knocked twice, soft but deliberate. After a long pause, I heard his footsteps. He opened the door and blinked once, slowly, as if trying to place me in the present. I thought I'd return the kindness, I said, holding out the package. He took it without a word and stepped aside. I walked into the familiar hallway, each creak of the floorboard beneath my feet heavier than the last. The workroom door was open, and I could see the same measuring tools laid out on the table, though nothing was in progress. I wondered if he had made anything since the dress. I wondered if he had been waiting for me too. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. He poured tea. We spoke in fragments. The weather. The news. A neighbor who had sold their house. Surface words, floating over deeper waters. I finally said what I had been holding in. I haven't worn it yet. He nodded, eyes fixed on the cup in his hand. I don't know what it means, I added. The dress, I mean. What it represents. He set the cup down gently. It doesn't have to mean anything, he said. But it did. And we both knew it. There was a silence between us that wasn't hostile, but filled with a kind of resignation. Not sadness, exactly. Not regret. Just the quiet understanding that something had happened. That it couldn't be undone. That whatever line we had crossed, we were now on the other side, even if nothing more had been said or done. When I stood to leave, he followed me to the door. This time, he didn't open it for me. I reached for the handle myself, but paused. Was this a mistake? I asked. He didn't answer right away. I think some mistakes teach us who we are, he said finally. And some just show us who we've been pretending to be. I nodded, unsure if that was meant for him or for me. The walk home felt longer. Each step echoed with the weight of everything unspoken. I didn't feel lighter. I didn't feel clearer. But I felt more honest, in a way that scared me. That evening, I hung the dress back in the closet. This time, I didn't close the door. I let it stay in sight, not as a threat or a temptation, but as a reminder. Of choices. Of boundaries. Of who I was when no one else was watching. The rain returned that night. I listened to it tap against the windows as I lay in bed, eyes open, staring into the dark. My husband would be home in 3 days. I didn't know what I was going to say to him. Or if I was going to say anything at all. But I knew the silence between us wouldn't feel the same. Not anymore. The day my husband returned, the house felt smaller than I remembered. Or maybe it wasn't the house. Maybe it was me, shrinking into myself, uncertain of what space I was allowed to take up. I spent the morning cleaning things that didn't need cleaning. I folded towels that were already folded, arranged fruit in the bowl, wiped counters twice. The silence that had once comforted me now made my ears ring. I wanted noise, any noise, just to drown out the thoughts I couldn't silence. His arrival was like every other return, calm, efficient, predictable. He walked in with 2 suitcases, one larger than the other, and placed them by the stairs before coming into the kitchen. I offered him tea. He accepted without question, unaware of the tremor in my voice or the stiffness in my shoulders. If he noticed, he didn't say. We talked about his trip, the people he met, the meetings he led. He spoke in summary, as he always did. He was good at reducing days into sentences. I listened, nodding at all the right intervals, inserting the occasional question to show I was engaged. It was a rhythm we had perfected over the years, this ritual of reconnection that never truly reached the heart of anything. He asked about my week. I said it was quiet. I told him I had met a friend, tried a new recipe, went for a few long walks. I did not mention the dress. I did not mention the visit. I did not mention the name that hovered at the edge of every breath I took. That night, we sat on opposite ends of the couch, watching a documentary about something neither of us cared about. His hand rested lightly on the armrest between us, not quite reaching for mine. I wondered if he noticed the space or if he'd grown used to it. I wondered when I had stopped reaching first. At bedtime, I went through the motions. I brushed my teeth, folded the blanket at the foot of the bed, dimmed the lights. When he joined me, I felt the shift in the mattress as he lay beside me. I kept my eyes closed, pretending to be asleep before he had even turned off the light. He didn't touch me. I didn't expect him to. In the morning, he left early for the office. I lingered in bed, staring at the ceiling for a long time. The dress still hung in the closet, untouched. I thought about hiding it. I thought about wearing it. I thought about burning it. In the end, I left it where it was, like a question I didn't want to answer yet. Later that day, I opened the calendar app on my phone and realized our anniversary was a week away. 21 years. I stared at the number for a long time, letting its weight settle into my chest. It didn't feel like 21 years. It felt like something older than time. Like the memory of something that used to matter, worn smooth by routine and years of silent compromise. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Grateful? Nostalgic? Guilty? Mostly I felt tired. Not physically, but in that deep, marrow-level way that makes even joy feel like effort. I made dinner that night. Something simple. He complimented it. I smiled. He asked if I'd like to go somewhere for our anniversary. A weekend trip, maybe. I said I'd think about it. I didn't know how to tell him that the idea of being alone together somewhere unfamiliar filled me with more dread than anticipation. I wasn't ready to be seen. Not by him. Not yet. The next day, I went for a walk without direction. I wandered through streets I hadn't been down in years, past cafes and bookstores and alleyways filled with echoes of other versions of myself. At some point, I found myself standing outside the studio again. I hadn't meant to go there. My feet had simply taken over when my mind wasn't paying attention. The curtains were drawn. The windows were closed. It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look welcoming either. I stood there for several minutes, debating whether to knock. I didn't. I turned around and walked back home. That night, while my husband worked on his laptop in the living room, I went upstairs and tried on the dress. I hadn't planned to. I had gone into the closet to grab a sweater, but my hand brushed the fabric and I froze. Without thinking, I pulled it out, stepped into it, zipped it up. It fit like memory. Not just in size, but in feeling. It held me. It shaped me. It reminded me of who I had been, who I might still be. I stood in front of the mirror and stared. Not with admiration. Not with shame. Just with observation. As if trying to decide if the woman in the reflection was still me. I didn't wear it downstairs. I didn't let my husband see. I took it off, folded it carefully, and placed it back in the garment bag. But the image stayed with me. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain. I lay in bed and listened to it for a long time. It reminded me of that day in the studio, the quiet tap against the windows, the smell of fabric and dust and something else I hadn't dared name. At breakfast, my husband mentioned again the idea of getting away. He'd found a resort by the coast. Secluded. Peaceful. I said we'd talk about it. He smiled, thinking we were moving forward. I didn't correct him. Because I wasn't sure myself. Later that afternoon, while sorting through a stack of old mail, I found a postcard I didn't recognize. No return address. Just a photograph of a quiet road, lined with trees, and a single sentence on the back. Sometimes a line crossed is just a path not taken. There was no signature. No handwriting I recognized. I stared at it for a long time. And then I placed it on the fridge, right next to a photo of us from years ago, smiling in a way I no longer remembered how to replicate. That evening, I made soup. I poured 2 bowls. I set the table. We ate in silence. And the rain kept falling. I kept the postcard on the refrigerator for 4 days before I finally took it down. Not because I no longer wanted to see it, but because it began to demand too much of me. Every time I entered the kitchen, my eyes went straight to it, as if it were calling out for some kind of decision, and I didn't have the clarity or courage to give it what it asked for. The photo of the tree-lined road seemed ordinary enough, yet the words on the back kept circling in my mind. Sometimes a line crossed is just a path not taken. I wasn't sure if it was meant to be a warning or a permission slip. Maybe it was both. The timing of its arrival, if it even was sent to me, felt too precise to ignore. But I also knew how easy it was to look for meaning in randomness when you didn't know what you wanted. I left the postcard in a drawer next to spare batteries and broken pens, where I wouldn't have to confront it every time I reached for milk. Our anniversary came and went without drama. My husband had booked a dinner reservation at a quiet restaurant near the river. I wore a dress he liked, not the one from the studio, of course, but something soft and familiar. The kind of dress that said, "I remember who I'm supposed to be." We made polite conversation, toasted with white wine, and returned home just after 9. He kissed my cheek in the hallway and went upstairs. I lingered in the kitchen for a while, not ready to be alone in the dark just yet. The following morning, he left for the office earlier than usual. I watched from the bedroom window as he backed out of the driveway, his movements as precise as ever. The car paused at the end of the street, turn signal blinking, before disappearing from view. I didn't look away until he was gone. That afternoon, I received a message. Short. To the point. Passing through town. Thought I'd leave something at the door. No name. No need. I recognized the tone immediately. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I simply waited. The knock came less than an hour later. I counted to 30 before opening the door. There was no one there, just a parcel, carefully wrapped in brown paper, resting neatly against the doorframe. I took it inside, placed it on the table, and stared at it for longer than I should have. It was lighter than I expected, almost weightless, but the moment I broke the seal, I felt the air shift. Inside was a sketch pad. I flipped it open slowly, page by page. Each sheet held a different design, pencil sketches, garment outlines, swatches of imagined dresses in motion. But on the final page, there was something different. Not a dress. Not a piece of clothing at all. It was a drawing of me. Not a portrait, exactly. Not realistic. More like a memory of a posture, a silhouette, a gesture. The curve of a spine mid-turn. The angle of a shoulder reaching for something unseen. It wasn't sensual. It wasn't dramatic. It was intimate in the most unexpected way. A moment captured without being performed. I closed the sketchpad and placed it back into the wrapping. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with my eyes open, heart racing softly beneath the sheets. It wasn't desire. It wasn't longing. It was a kind of recognition. A knowing. Someone had seen me fully, quietly, and without asking for anything in return. The next day, I walked to the studio again. This time, the curtains were open. He saw me approaching and stepped into the doorway before I reached the porch. He didn't smile. Neither did I. We stood in silence for a few moments before he stepped aside, letting me pass without a word. Inside, the air was different, brighter somehow, but heavier too. The room looked unchanged, yet everything felt altered. I sat down in the wooden chair near the window. He stood by the table, adjusting a pattern that didn't need adjusting. "I got your message," I said. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the fabric. "You didn't have to leave anything," I continued. "I know." The silence that followed didn't feel awkward. It felt necessary. Like the space between breaths when you're trying to steady yourself. "I don't know what any of this means," I said finally. "Maybe it doesn't have to mean anything," he replied. I shook my head. "It already does." He met my gaze then, and there was something in his expression I couldn't name. Not affection. Not regret. Just clarity. The kind of clarity that comes only after you've let go of trying to control the outcome. "I never planned any of this," he said. Neither did I. We didn't speak for a while after that. The minutes passed slowly, each one stretching into the next without urgency. Eventually, I stood to leave. As I reached the door, I turned back once more. "I'm not sure if I'll come back," I said. "I know." He didn't try to stop me. That mattered more than I could explain. On the walk home, I felt lighter, though nothing had been resolved. There was no grand confession, no dramatic parting. Just a moment of honesty, shared quietly between two people who had crossed something unnamed. When I returned home, my husband was already back from work. He greeted me from the living room, asked how my day had been. I said it was good. Uneventful. He didn't ask for more. I didn't offer. Later, as we sat on the couch in silence, the space between us felt different. Not smaller. Not larger. Just real. Before bed, I took the dress from the closet again. I held it up to the light, watched the way the fabric caught the shadows. I didn't put it on. I just stood there, holding it, as if trying to decide whether it still belonged to the version of myself I was becoming. The rain returned that night. Soft at first, then steadier. I lay in bed listening to it, wondering how something so gentle could wear away even the sharpest edges over time. And in the quiet, I made peace with one truth: not every path leads somewhere. But sometimes, walking it is enough. There was a heaviness in the air that morning, the kind that settles over everything without warning. Even the sunlight seemed muted, filtered through layers of clouds too thick to break. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching the steam rise from my tea, trying not to think about anything at all. But still, my thoughts wandered, looping back to the sketchpad, to the drawing, to the silence that lingered after I left the studio. My husband had left early again, another meeting, another presentation. His schedule, once something that gave me breathing space, now only reminded me how much we had forgotten how to exist together. The house was too quiet. The familiar creaks in the floorboards felt louder in his absence, and I found myself listening for sounds that weren't there. I didn't have a plan when I stepped out the door. I told myself I was just going for a walk, but I didn't choose my route at random. My steps led me without effort, without resistance. By the time I reached his street, I already knew I wouldn't turn around. He opened the door before I knocked, as if he'd been waiting. There were no words exchanged, only the briefest of glances. I crossed the threshold, and he stepped aside without speaking. The air inside was still and warm, and everything looked exactly as it had before, familiar, but no longer innocent. We moved around each other quietly, like dancers who had rehearsed this choreography 100 times. I removed my coat and placed it on the hook near the door. He poured 2 cups of tea, the steam curling into the air between us. We sat at the small table near the window, each of us occupying our usual place, as if the space had been reserved for this moment all along. The silence was comfortable now. Not because it lacked weight, but because it no longer required translation. He looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "You wore the dress?" I nodded. "Once. Just in front of the mirror." He didn't press for more. He only looked down at his cup and traced the rim with one finger. I could tell he wanted to say something else, but he didn't. And I was grateful for that. The moment didn't need to be named. Later, we moved to the living room. He pulled out an old photo album from a shelf, something I hadn't expected. He placed it on the table and opened it carefully, page by page, showing me pieces of his life I'd never seen. A childhood photo with his first dog. A faded black and white picture of his mother sewing at the kitchen table. Him as a teenager, standing beside an unfamiliar woman I assumed was his first wife. Each photo held a story he only told in fragments. His voice stayed calm, but I could sense the tenderness beneath each sentence. He didn't dwell on any one image too long. He turned the pages slowly, deliberately, as if allowing me to walk through the past at my own pace. At one point, he paused on a photo I recognized, a much younger version of me, standing awkwardly at a family barbecue, holding a plate of food and wearing an expression somewhere between nervous and amused. I had forgotten that day. I must have been barely 22. My hair was longer then, and I looked uncertain in a way I didn't know I had ever shown. He didn't comment. Neither did I. He turned the page. The light shifted as the afternoon wore on. Shadows stretched across the floor, and the room grew dimmer. We sat there for what felt like hours, not speaking, not needing to. The weight of everything unspoken hovered between us, but it no longer felt dangerous. It simply was. When I finally stood, it was without ceremony. He didn't try to stop me. There was no dramatic goodbye, no promises made or broken. Just a shared understanding, the kind that doesn't require explanation. Outside, the sky had deepened into a pale gray. The wind had picked up slightly, tugging at the hem of my coat as I walked. My footsteps echoed against the pavement, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I needed to rush home. There was nothing urgent waiting for me there. Just the same walls, the same quiet, the same man who hadn't noticed I'd been disappearing slowly, one layer at a time. But something had changed. I could feel it in my shoulders, in the rhythm of my breath. I had made a choice, even if I hadn't spoken it aloud. A choice to reclaim something I had let go of long ago, the part of myself that didn't ask for permission to exist. When I got home, I went upstairs and took the dress out again. I hung it in front of the mirror, watching how the fabric moved in the low light. I didn't put it on. I just stood there, letting the silence settle around me like a second skin. Later that evening, as I made dinner, my husband came into the kitchen and stood behind me. He rested his hand lightly on my back, a gesture so small, so habitual, that it might have passed unnoticed on any other day. But this time, I felt it. Not the warmth, not the contact, but the absence of meaning behind it. It was a touch without presence, a movement without thought. I stirred the pot slowly, careful not to let the emotion rise too high. I didn't turn around. I didn't speak. I let the moment pass like so many before it. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I stood by the window and watched the street outside. A single light flickered at the end of the block. The wind had died down, and everything was still. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly, listening to the sound of my own breath. It was the only sound I trusted now. Before I turned away, I whispered something I hadn't allowed myself to say before, not even in thought. I'm not coming back. Not to that version of myself. Not to that silence. I didn't know what the next step would be. I didn't know how much more I was willing to lose. But I knew this, the night we spent together, unspoken though it was, had drawn a line I could no longer pretend didn't exist. We spent the night together. And nothing after would be the same. The days that followed were marked by a peculiar quietness, the kind that doesn't scream or demand attention, but instead lingers in corners, unspoken and unresolved. I didn't go back to the studio. I didn't reach out, and neither did he. There was no need. What needed to happen had already taken shape. A silence had been cast over it like a cloth, but the shape beneath it remained solid, undeniable, and waiting. At home, I moved through my days with practiced efficiency. I cooked meals, answered calls, folded laundry with steady hands. My husband, unaware of the shift, carried on with the ease of routine. If he noticed anything different in me, he didn't ask. Or perhaps he did notice and chose not to confront it. There are forms of denial so subtle, so deeply embedded in long relationships, that they wear the face of peace. One afternoon, I sat in the living room with a photo album open on my lap. Not the old ones filled with our wedding and early vacations, but a newer one, the kind we started filling in later years, almost as an obligation. Events without emotion. Dinners, birthdays, work retreats. Smiling faces in static poses. I stared at an image of the two of us from last spring, standing beside a blooming cherry tree, both smiling for the camera. His arm was around my shoulder. My hand rested lightly on his chest. And yet, as I looked at it, I remembered how cold the day had been. How distant I had felt. How I had forced my smile. I closed the album. It wasn't that I wanted to hurt him. I didn't. I still cared for him, in the strange, quiet way that people who have shared decades often do. But something had fractured beneath the surface. Something irreparable. Not because of betrayal or violence or anger, but because of absence. Absence of awareness, of attention, of presence. And now, even as we shared space, our worlds no longer touched. That evening, while washing the dishes, I noticed a letter sticking halfway out of the mail basket near the front door. It wasn't a bill or advertisement. Just a plain white envelope with my name on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. I dried my hands and opened it slowly. Inside was a single piece of paper. No greeting. No signature. I saw her yesterday. She looks like him. Same eyes. Same mouth. She's 14 now. I read it twice. 3 times. My breath stilled. I folded the paper and placed it back inside the envelope, my hands moving automatically. I stood there for several minutes, unsure what I was feeling. Shock. Confusion. A dull, rising discomfort that buzzed behind my ribs. I didn't know who the message was from. I didn't know if it was meant for me or if it had found its way into my mailbox by accident. But I knew who it was about. Later, when I tried to sleep, the words echoed inside me. The thought of him having another life, a child he never mentioned, cut through the stillness like glass. I hadn't asked about his past. I hadn't dared. Perhaps I had wanted to preserve the illusion of our connection, clean, self-contained, without baggage. But reality didn't care for illusions. The next morning, I walked through the city without a destination. I passed parks, bakeries, closed storefronts, letting the motion of walking dull the edges of my thoughts. I stopped at a bench by the river and sat there watching the water, gray and slow, moving with the weight of time. I tried to picture her, the girl in the letter. A teenager now. With his features. A living, breathing link to a history I had never been part of. I imagined her asking questions one day. Wanting to understand who he was, what he meant to people, what his silences had concealed. Would I be part of those answers? Or just another omission? The riverbank was quiet, save for the wind-rattling branches above. A few feet away, an elderly woman tossed crumbs to a pair of pigeons. I watched her hands, deliberate, gentle. There was something soothing in their rhythm. Eventually, I stood and walked home. When I returned, my husband was in the kitchen, unpacking groceries. I watched him for a moment, the way he moved, his posture, the small hum he made when he read labels. I wondered how many times I had watched him like this without truly seeing. I wondered how many times he had done the same to me. He turned and smiled. I smiled back. A reflex. That night, after dinner, I sat alone in the bedroom while he watched television downstairs. I opened the closet and stared at the dress again. I had thought of it as a symbol once. A beginning. But now it felt like a question, one I didn't yet know how to answer. I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer. The next day, I wrote a letter. I didn't address it. I didn't sign it. I didn't intend to send it. But I wrote it anyway. I need to know why you never told me. About her. About what that meant. I don't want confessions. I want honesty. I want to understand the part of you that stayed hidden even when you looked straight at me. You showed me pieces of yourself that felt real. Was that only possible because the rest of you was buried beneath the life you built elsewhere? When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer as the dress. I didn't know what I would do with it. I just knew I couldn't carry the questions unspoken any longer. Later that week, I returned to the studio. Not to see him. Not to talk. Just to stand outside, to look at the windows and remember what they had once held. The curtains were drawn. The lights were off. The silence inside felt absolute. I walked away. At home, I found my husband reading in the living room. He looked up when I entered, as if trying to measure something in my face. I sat across from him, hands folded in my lap. We should take a trip, I said. Somewhere quiet. He blinked. Now? Soon. He nodded slowly. All right. And just like that, the idea of escape became real. But in my mind, I knew this wasn't about traveling. It wasn't about saving anything. It was about giving space to end gently. To let something dissolve, not in anger, but in understanding. There was a difference between leaving and disappearing. And I was starting to understand which one I had already done. It had been raining steadily for days. Not the kind of dramatic storm that demands attention, but a persistent drizzle that softened the world into something quieter, blurred. Each morning, I opened the curtains to the same pale gray light and watched as the water traced lines down the windows. I found a strange comfort in the monotony of it, as though the weather had agreed to keep me hidden while I figured out what to do with myself. My husband and I didn't speak much about the trip. After I mentioned it, he made a few casual suggestions, places by the coast, a cabin in the hills, and I nodded at each one without committing. He seemed relieved just to have something to plan. A neutral task. Something to fill the space between us. I didn't correct him. Letting him think we were doing something together felt easier than explaining that I didn't know what I wanted anymore. I hadn't returned to the studio, though the urge to pass by lingered at the back of my mind. I imagined it often, standing across the street, looking at the window, wondering whether he was still inside, whether he had read the letter I never sent. Whether he had told her about me. The girl. 14. I still couldn't picture her clearly, but I felt her presence now like a distant echo. A version of him that existed outside everything I had seen. Sometimes I wondered if he had ever meant to tell me, or if he had planned to keep her tucked away in the part of his life that didn't overlap with mine. Perhaps he had never expected anything with me to go beyond a passing impulse. Perhaps I had been just another moment he allowed himself, knowing it would end. But that thought didn't sit right. Not because I wanted to believe in something more, but because I remembered the way he looked at me. Not with hunger. Not even with affection. But with recognition. A quiet acknowledgement of something familiar, something shared. People don't fake that. Not convincingly. One morning, after waking before dawn, I stood at the kitchen sink with my fingers wrapped around a mug I didn't drink from. I listened to the sound of water dripping from the roof outside, and without thinking, I pulled open the drawer where I had placed the sketchpad, the letter, and the folded dress. They were still there, untouched. The paper had softened slightly from the damp air. I ran my fingers along the edge of the envelope, tracing the crease. Something inside me had begun to settle. Not like dust, but like weight. An understanding that nothing was going to be as it had been before, no matter how much I tried to return to the shape of my old life. The dress would never be just a dress again. My marriage would never be just a marriage again. And I could no longer pretend I was invisible. That same afternoon, I left the house with no destination. My husband was at work. The streets were empty, save for the occasional delivery van or umbrellaed pedestrian. I walked slowly, letting my thoughts unfold without pressure. At some point, I found myself outside a small cafe I used to frequent years ago, back when I still worked part-time and had lunch breaks to fill with journals and books. I went inside and ordered a tea. The server didn't recognize me. I took a seat by the window and watched the world move in slow, wet rhythms. I didn't pull out my phone. I didn't bring anything to read. I just sat, letting the silence settle into my bones. A few tables over, a teenage girl sat with an older woman, her mother, probably. They weren't talking much, but there was an ease between them. The girl looked bored in the way only teenagers can. The woman sipped from a tall mug, glancing occasionally at her daughter with a quiet fondness. I watched them without meaning to. Not out of envy. Not out of sadness. Just curiosity. Observation. As if trying to understand something I had missed. When I left the cafe, I didn't walk home right away. I walked toward the studio. This time, not just to pass by. I didn't knock. I didn't expect to be let in. I just stood across the street, looking at the windows. The curtains were half drawn. A light was on in the back. Someone was home. I thought about going to the door. I thought about asking questions. About confronting the things that had been left unsaid. But I stayed where I was. It wasn't fear that kept me there, it was clarity. I knew now that no answer would change what had already been decided, whether spoken or not. I turned around and walked home. That evening, my husband and I had dinner in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, but a mutual one. I realized we had reached a point where the absence of conversation no longer needed to be explained. It had become part of us, like an old piece of furniture neither of us liked but couldn't bring ourselves to throw away. After dinner, I went upstairs alone. I opened the drawer again and pulled out the sketch pad. I flipped to the final page, the drawing of me. I looked at the posture, the turn of the body, the way he had captured not just my form, but my presence. It struck me how rare it was to be seen like that. Fully. Without decoration. Then I opened the letter I had written to him, read the words again, and realized I didn't need to send it. I had already lived it. Every question I had asked had been answered in the silence between us. I folded the paper, closed the sketchpad, and placed them both back into the drawer. I left the dress out. I hung it on the back of the door, not to wear it, but to let it breathe. It wasn't a symbol anymore. It was just a part of my story now, one I wasn't ashamed of, one I no longer had to explain or hide. That night, I slept with the window open. The rain had slowed to a soft whisper, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to listen for anything. Because some endings don't come with final words or grand gestures. Some endings just come with stillness. And stillness, I was learning, could be a kind of peace. Time passed in strange increments after that. Not fast, not slow, just unmeasured. Days no longer carried the urgency they once did. Mornings blended into afternoons, and evenings arrived like quiet reminders of everything left unsaid. The rain had finally stopped, and the first signs of spring began to appear, thin buds on trees, the faint scent of wet soil, a newness in the air that I wasn't sure I was ready for. The dress remained on the back of the door, untouched but no longer hidden. I stopped thinking of it as a decision to be made. It had become part of the room, part of me. Sometimes I would glance at it without meaning to, like catching my reflection in a window, not to admire or critique, but simply to acknowledge. It was there. I was here. We both still existed. One morning, while making tea, I caught sight of the postcard again. I had placed it back on the refrigerator without thinking, perhaps as a reminder, perhaps as a placeholder for a version of myself I was still becoming. The words were faint now, the ink slightly smudged, sometimes a line crossed is just a path not taken. I read them again and again, wondering whether the person who wrote it meant for it to comfort or to warn. I never found out who had sent it. By then, I wasn't sure it mattered. My husband and I did end up taking the trip, just as we said we would. A quiet town by the coast, the kind of place where everything closes early and the only sounds at night are the waves brushing against the shore. We stayed in a modest inn with creaky floors and floral curtains. The bed was too soft, and the water pressure too weak, but it was peaceful. Familiar in its imperfections. We didn't talk much during the trip. We walked along the beach, ate simple meals, and watched the tides change. At one point, sitting on a bench overlooking the water, he reached for my hand and held it loosely, like someone trying to remember what holding hands used to feel like. I let him. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. I think we both understood, in our own quiet ways, that this wasn't a new beginning. It was a closing. Not bitter, not dramatic, just honest. A soft landing instead of a crash. On our last night there, I woke before dawn and stepped outside onto the small balcony. The sky was still dark, but the faintest line of light traced the horizon. I wrapped my arms around myself and breathed in the cold, salty air. It felt clean, like something had been wiped away. Back home, everything was as we had left it. The mail had piled up slightly, the house smelled of stillness, and the dress was right where I had left it. I unpacked slowly, methodically. There was no rush. Life resumed, but it no longer felt cyclical. It felt linear, moving toward something I couldn't yet define. A few days later, I received another letter. This one was addressed. His handwriting. My name on the envelope, written with care. I stood in the hallway holding it for a long moment before I opened it. It was short. Thoughtful. I didn't tell you about her because I didn't know how. I was afraid you'd see the wrong version of me, or maybe the right one. But she exists. And I love her. That doesn't change what I saw in you. Thank you for letting yourself be seen, even briefly. That was more than I expected, and more than I deserved. There was no return address. I didn't look for one. I folded the letter and placed it next to the first one, in the same drawer. I didn't cry. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt whole. Like something had finally returned to its rightful place, even if that place was no longer in my life. In the weeks that followed, I made quiet changes. I spent more time outside. I rearranged furniture. I cleaned out drawers that had gone untouched for years. I began volunteering at the local library on Saturdays, something I had once talked about doing but never made time for. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't need to. One afternoon, while shelving books, I came across a novel I hadn't read in decades. I pulled it from the shelf and opened to a random page. A sentence stood out: "Some lives are not meant to be shared, only witnessed." I closed the book and held it for a long moment before placing it gently back in its place. That night, I wore the dress. Not for an occasion. Not for a person. Just for myself. It fit as it always had. A perfect balance of structure and softness. I stood in front of the mirror and turned slowly, not to assess, but to feel. My reflection met me without judgment. There was no smile, no pose. Just a woman standing in her own skin, knowing exactly who she was. When my husband came home, he paused in the hallway, his eyes resting on me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We looked at each other for a moment, two people who had shared so much and lost just as much in the spaces between. I turned off the light and walked past him, my footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. In the days that followed, there was no grand conversation. No confessions. But there was change. A shift in the way we moved around each other. Less avoidance, more understanding. We no longer tried to be what we were. We began to allow each other to be what we had become. And that, I learned, was a kind of love too. Not the kind that demands or claims, but the kind that releases. That honors. That lets go without bitterness. Months passed. Seasons changed. The dress remained in my closet, no longer a question, no longer a symbol. Just fabric and thread, shaped by hands that once knew me well. And me, shaped by everything I had held, and everything I had let go.